Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the first day of our third-party risk management bootcamp. VinMinder, who is now an in-contracts company, is proud to have hosted biannual third-party risk management bootcamps for 8 years now, and we're excited to have you join us for another one around the campfire over the next 3 days. We're going to go on a virtual camping trip to discuss important third-party risk management topics. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. In the Related Content widget, you will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has thousands of educational resources, and links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful if you'd like to learn more about certain topics discussed today. We'll also point these out to you throughout today's presentation. You'll also notice underneath the slide area and next to the Related Content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout the next 3 days, as our sessions will cover important steps through the entire life cycle. This 3-day bootcamp is eligible to earn up to 6 CPE credits, 1 for each hour, 2 credits per day. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all polling questions that appear on your screen during each session's presentation and remain in attendance for the entire live sessions. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, October 4th. That will need to be completed as well in order to receive the credit. Today we'll have a session presented by VinMinder's Hillary Dewhurst, Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss criticality and risk ratings in implementing a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. After that, Kelly Vick, VinMinder's president, will discuss critical vendor contracts and an overview of fourth and nth party vendors. To see the full schedule for the next 3 days, you can visit the agenda on our website. A link to that page can be found in the Related Content widget. To get this bootcamp kicked off, I'd like to give the floor to VinMinder's new CEO, Michael Berman, who is going to provide some updates.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jessie, for the introduction. As Jessie mentioned, my name is Michael Berman, and I am the founder and CEO of InContracts. I wanted to join you for a quick moment to introduce myself and share some important news. In early September, VinMinder was acquired by InContracts, and together we are now the leading provider of integrated risk, vendor, and compliance management software to over 4,000 financial institutions, mortgage companies, and fintech companies. As a newly combined company, we now serve over 5,000 clients. This is an exciting move that has brought together the strengths and expertise of our two powerhouse organizations, and together we are looking forward to providing you with the best options for comprehensive end-to-end solutions for your risk and compliance needs. I'm excited to be part of this week's bootcamp event and for the opportunity to continue to support you and your peers in furthering your knowledge on third-party risk management. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today who have a lot of very valuable information to share. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jessie, who will kick us off by introducing our first session speaker. Back to you, Jessie.
Thank you, Michael. Let's now dive into the first session with Hillary Dewhurst, covering the basics of what you need to know when it comes to the difference between criticality and risk ratings, as well as steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. Well, this session is all about criticality and risk ratings, and we're going to start off with helping you understand the types of risks that we're looking to identify and how to determine if that vendor engagement is critical or not. We'll also dive into the concept of residual risk, and we'll talk about how to use and apply these concepts of inherent and residual risk in your process. We'll wrap up with some key takeaways, so let's get ready and jump right in. At the beginning of every relationship, we go through an activity called planning. And it's during this activity where we determine, one, if the product and service is going to be in scope for our third-party risk management. We're going to look at the risks associated with that product and service and the relationship. And then we're going to determine if that particular product or service is actually critical to our operation. Now, to have an effective discussion today, we have to go through a few terms. So the first one is risk. I don't think I need to really tell anyone what risk is. But when it comes to inherent risk, that's a specific term that relates to all the risk that naturally occurs or exists within a product or service. So for example, any product or service that requires access to sensitive information naturally carries the inherent risk of information security risk and privacy risk. Criticality is a term that really speaks to business impact. So what is essential for our operations or for our customers, right? So if something is critical, it's something that we have to do business as usual. Residual risk, on the other hand, is sort of an evaluation of the risks that remain or the leftover level of risk after we've applied controls and risk management practices to reduce the occurrence, the impact, the severity of that risk. So let's talk about risk ratings versus criticality to begin. First of all, criticality, or the term critical, is not a risk rating. Okay? It is a designation or a label that we use to identify that subset of vendor relationships that are most important to our operations or to our customers. Every vendor engagement should be rated as either critical or not critical. Risk ratings, or risk levels, on the other hand, really are reflecting the aggregate risk of the vendor engagement. And they're thinking about both the types and amounts of risk that exist in that product or service. As a best practice, we usually use a scale like high, moderate, and low to determine what level of risk the vendor has. So let's talk about inherent risk for a moment, because it's a really important concept. Again, inherent risk is always present in every vendor engagement, and it's always the raw or untreated risk. Because when we're assessing it, we're looking at it before we thought about any potential processes or controls that could reduce that risk. Now, the best way to identify and measure these risks is through something called an inherent risk assessment. The inherent risk assessment is always an internal document that should be completed by the vendor owner or the person in the organization who's really wanting to bring in that vendor. It's important to note that vendors are never responsible for completing inherent risk assessments. As we move forward in the process, we'll request that the vendor completes a different set of information as a vendor risk questionnaire, but for right now, it's important to note that inherent risk assessments are for internal use only. Okay, so what types of risk are we looking for when we're doing an inherent risk assessment? Well, there's a handful of vendor risks. These are just a few, and I can't go through all of them, but let's just pick out a couple of big ones. So there's information security risk. This is also cyber risk, but it can also be physical data security. And we know that this is a big deal because cyber attacks are more frequent, they're larger, and they're causing more damage. We also have reputation risk, right? The risk that something the vendor does can really impact your brand and reputation. We have transaction risk, which is the risk that occurs when you depend on a vendor to process financial transactions like a credit card payment on your behalf. We have operational risk, which covers a whole host of things, but basically anything that can happen that would interrupt our operations. and that can be because of something that happened internally or externally. We also have financial health risk, which is the risk that the vendor will not be able to meet their contractual requirements because they don't have enough money to pay staff or work on innovation or research or development. Now, again, these aren't all of the risks, and some more common risks that we're seeing pop up are things like concentration risk or risks related to artificial intelligence, or even ESG risk, which is environmental, social, and governance risk. Now, a good inherent risk questionnaire is going to ask specific questions about each of the risk domains, and these are just some examples. So, for example, if we want to understand the business continuity risk, we would ask, would a disruption in service cause a material impact to our organization or that of our clients or customers? For cybersecurity, we might ask if it's a technology-related service that's going to integrate with our network, or will the vendor need access to our network? For transactional, maybe we would want to ask if the vendor processes financial transactions on our behalf, and do they have access to process any PCI data? So a couple of things to understand is, again, this is always an internal document, and it's usually a shorter questionnaire that's just trying to identify the specific risk areas that we need to investigate and understand how much of that risk is present in the relationship. So once that inherent risk assessment is completed, it should result in a risk rating or score. And the best practices for these risk levels, again, is to use a system of low, moderate, and high. Now, if your organization is using something different, that's okay, as long as you can clearly articulate the attributes of each risk rating and be sure that there's enough difference between them to really warrant different treatments and processes. I also want to mention that your risk rating methodology should always be standardized and documented. Keep in mind that risk is something that is not a one and done, that we have to reassess it periodically. And again, we should not use critical as a risk rating. Okay, once we have those inherent risk ratings, what do we do with them? How do we apply them in our process? Well, the first thing to understand is that risk ratings are always a tool to help you identify which vendors need the most attention and focus, right? And those risk ratings should also help us determine the risk management routines that we're going to put in place. So, for example, a high-risk vendor relationship needs a lot more attention and a lot more frequent interventions than a low-risk one does. Additionally, those risks that we identified are going to help us scope our due diligence to figure out exactly what controls the vendor needs to have. Now, keep in mind that your auditors and regulators are going to expect that you have a risk rating for every single vendor. But as a best practice, you need to do that at the product or service level, not just the relationship level. Now, with that, we're going to take a quick break and do a poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the bootcamp. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, my organization conducts an inherent risk assessment for each vendor's individual product or service. Yes, no, or not sure? Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question that is coming from the audience.
Okay.
And that question is, can you explain why you should use inherent rather than residual risk to determine ongoing vendor monitoring assessment cadence?
Sure. So this can be confusing, but let me see if I can clear it up. We always use the inherent risk rating because that is actually the truest reflection of the risks that are involved in that product or service. So when you think about residual risks, again, it's just a data point to help you determine if you're going to go forward with that relationship or you're going to retain that relationship. If we were to use the residual risk, the important thing is to remember that those controls that we're basing that score off of, that residual risk score, they can fail or change over time. So that can be a big audit issue, it can be a big regulatory examiner issue, and it really doesn't reflect the true level of risk that we need to be managing. So always use your inherent risk ratings or scores to determine your cadence for monitoring, risk reassessments, due diligence, etc. I hope that helps.
Thank you everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, please take a look at the related content widget. There you can find our Separating Vendor Criticality from Risk Ratings infographic available for you. Back to you, Hillary.
So now that we have a risk rating, the next important piece of information is whether that vendor engagement or relationship is going to be critical or non-critical for our operations or our customers. Now, how do you figure that out? Well, we like to suggest 3 basic questions. And if you answer yes to any of these, it's likely that you're dealing with a critical vendor. The first one is, would a sudden loss of this vendor cause a disruption to our organization? Would that disruption impact our customers? And if the time for the vendor to recover operations exceeded 24 hours, would there be a negative impact to our organization? Now, it's important to identify critical vendors, and in some organizations, you may need to ask a few more questions. So those additional questions might be something like, would there be significant cost, resources, or time involved if we have to bring that product or service in-house? Or would our organization be subject to extra regulatory scrutiny if the vendor did not provide the products and services, right? There's a compliance aspect to it. Or would the vendor's failure cause significant harm to our organization's brand or reputation? Now, those are some really good questions to ask. You can certainly add more, but whatever it is, you need to always make sure that you document and formalize that criteria so that each engagement is being held to the same standard. Now, why it's so important to understand who's critical and who's not is because, first of all, your critical relationships, the ones that could basically shut the doors on your business, are going to need the most extensive due diligence. They're going to need the highest level of risk and performance management, and we need to always have evidence of those practices, right, to provide to our auditors and examiners. They also need the highest level of contract consideration and review. So we need to really go through those contracts with a fine-tooth comb, make sure that they're written with care. They also have to undergo periodic risk reassessment and due diligence at least annually. And they need to be identified for senior management and the board. They should also always be considered for your organization's internal business continuity and resiliency planning. And keep in mind that if a regulator or auditor comes, critical vendors are going to be the first ones they ask about. Okay, so now we understand inherent risk and the risk levels, and we know what critical means. So how do we get from inherent risk to residual risk? Well, again, inherent risk is that baseline risk, that untreated risk that is just there naturally. We give it a risk rating, and then we do something called vendor due diligence, which we're going to talk about in the second session today. But this is the process to really review the vendor's organization, operations, and control environment. Controls, for those who don't know, are those risk management methods, tools, processes that are used to reduce the occurrence, likelihood, impact, or severity of the risk. Once we've evaluated those controls, we can kind of determine how effective they are and come up with a residual risk score. Now, the basic formula for this is inherent risk plus validated controls equals residual risk. So what does that all mean? This can be a little complicated, so let's look at some examples. All right, because residual risk can be so tricky, Let's spend some time looking at a visual and really walking through how this might work. Now, in this example, let's say that the vendor, product, or service is a call center that is doing collections and processing payments, right? So we require them to be open 24/7. That means there's incredible operational risk, right? They've got to be open all the time. There's also a lot of compliance risk. Not only are they processing those payments and talking to those customers, but they have to be licensed in the states where they operate. There's a lot of transaction risk because they are processing those payments. And of course, they have all those customers' names, balances, past due, account numbers, address, social. So there's a lot of cybersecurity and privacy risk. Now, we haven't looked at any of the controls yet, but we can see that just looking at the inherent risk, it's a pretty high risk engagement. But as we go through our due diligence process and we look at all their policies and procedures and all their evidence of these controls, we can determine that the vendor does have really good specific controls in place. For example, that operational risk, that 24/7 service, is supported by really well-developed and tested business continuity plan. That compliance risk is balanced by the fact that the vendor does have current licenses for all the jurisdictions where they're operating, and let's say they also have really great policies and training around regulatory risk for things like Fair Credit Reporting Act, etc. And the vendor is also PCI certified, so we know they've passed the standard level of control for taking credit card payments. If we also stop and review their SOC 2 Type 2 report, we'll see that they have very thorough and well-tested cybersecurity and privacy controls. So as you can see now, these controls are counterbalancing some of that risk, which means the remaining risk of the engagement is somewhere closer to the moderate level of risk. But let's talk about that. So the big question is, how do we use residual risk in our program? Well, the first thing I want to emphasize is that residual risk ratings or scores are merely a data point that will help us make decisions about how to proceed with that specific vendor relationship. So the first thing we have to decide is if the risk was mitigated enough. Do we need additional controls or different controls? Or do we need to walk away altogether? We also use it to understand our level of confidence in those controls. So do we believe that the proposed controls reduce the likelihood, occurrence, severity, or impact of that risk? We also keep residual risk in mind to help us keep focused on those tips that are still very risky, where maybe we couldn't reduce enough of the risk. Most importantly, it's essential to understand that we never use residual risk to set the cadence or frequency of our other risk management routines. For example, risk reassessment, due diligence, performance management should all be based on inherent risk only. And that's because regardless of those controls can break or become ineffective over time, but the inherent risk still always exists. So only use inherent risk to set your risk management. So the key takeaways for our session today are really about criticality and risk rating. Remember, critical is not a risk rating, it's a label we use to identify that subset of vendors. And critical vendors are always going to require the utmost care and attention and focus. Risk ratings help us identify the specific types and amounts of risk in the engagement, and they help us establish those risk management routines and processes. They also should be looked at the product or service level, and if a vendor provides more than one product or service, the vendor's risk rating should default to the highest risk rating of the engagements they have. And with that, we are going to get ready for our next session.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillary, for that session. If you found this session informative and are interested in learning more about the topic, please be aware that you can find standalone sessions available at vinminder.com/webinar. or by clicking the Webinars link in the Related Content widget. Within our on-demand library, you'll also find the difference between inherent and residual vendor risk and how to classify who is a critical vendor webinar sessions. Now we'll move into our next session, steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. Hillary will discuss risk-based vendor due diligence and how it will save you time, resources, and be more effective in managing vendor risk. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, so jumping into our next session here, it's all about vendor due diligence. What does that mean? What is risk-based due diligence? And what kind of things should we be collecting and evaluating? We're also going to talk a little bit about what to do when the vendors don't give you what you want and wrap up with some key takeaways. So the next big thing is, what is risk-based vendor due diligence? Why does it matter? Well, this is essentially the part of the process where you're validating the legitimacy and reputation of a vendor business before you get into a relationship with them. So it's very important. It's kind of looking before you leap. It's also the process of validating that their risk management practices and controls are, in fact, going to be sufficient to remediate the risks associated with those products and services that you're buying from them. Okay, so there's a couple fundamental things we need to remember about due diligence. So the first one is, it's always risk-based. That means the more risk we have, the more intensive and thorough our due diligence has to be. The next thing is, it's always a documented and evidence-based process. Remember, we just can't make assumptions. We need to document our decisions and be able to provide evidence that will support that decision. It always requires that a qualified subject matter expert is reviewing the controls and identifying any gaps. And if there are gaps or remediations that are required, the subject matter expert has to review them also. It's also super important to remember that vendor due diligence is not something we just do once. It's not set it and forget it. It's something that we do on a regular basis throughout the relationship. It's always important to remember that this is a best practice. We have to know what's going on with those vendors that we're going into business with. But for many organizations, it's also a regulatory requirement. Okay, while this is not a comprehensive list by any means, it's just here to illustrate that due diligence is a fundamental requirement for many, many regulations across different industries. It's also a requirement for many certifying bodies like NIST, ISO, and ITIL. Don't forget that it's also a requirement for a lot of state, federal, and international privacy laws as well. Okay, so let's talk about due diligence as a process. And the interesting thing here is it's just not one process. It's actually a multi-part process. So the very first thing we have to do is scope our due diligence based on the risks that we discovered in the inherent risk assessment. So what types of risks are there and how severe are those risks? And is this vendor going to be critical to our operations? For each risk domain that we've identified, we need to start collecting vendor information and documentation. So we want to get all of their basic information, and in a lot of cases, we'll ask them to complete a questionnaire pertaining to each risk domain. So they might have a cybersecurity section and a compliance section. We'll also ask them for documentation that serves as evidence of controls for each risk domain. We may need to do an on-site visit or get additional information for them. Now, once we have all the information collected and it's complete, we turn it over to our subject matter risk expert. And they are going to do a very thorough evaluation of all the information and assess the sufficiency of those controls by risk domain. Now, it's important to note that most risk domains are handled by just one person. It's very rare to find someone who's doing multiple risk domains at one time. So we need to wait until everybody's completed with their information and understand if they identified any issues or gaps that need to be addressed. Their findings and their qualified opinion should be documented in a risk review or control reviews report. At that point, as an organization, we can start thinking about the residual risk. Is the remaining risk acceptable? Can we move forward with the engagement or retain the engagement, or are there issues that need to be remediated? Maybe there's additional or different controls that need to be applied. Any issue that needs to be remediated, we need to understand that this is something that has to be done before we can sign or renew the contract, or if it's something that can be written into the contract to be remediated at a later date. Now, we use this graphic to really illustrate that the effort and the time required to get through due diligence is really going to depend on that risk level or criticality. So as you'll see, with low risk vendors, we're just getting some very baseline information and maybe a little bit of documentation. That increases as we move up to moderate. We might start looking for controls around relevant risk domains. And in high risk, we're collecting all that baseline information. We're getting a comprehensive vendor risk questionnaire, lots of documentation. Maybe we need additional information, and maybe we need to go on site. But when it comes to the criticals, we're looking at all that information, and we're considering how those controls work with our internal controls. We probably need to go on site, and we may need to even interview the owners and the principals of the company. Okay, so let's talk about what documents we need from these vendors. Now, we're going to start off with what we call baseline documents. These are for every vendor, regardless of risk rating or criticality. And these are basically the pieces of information that we're going to gather and verify just to make sure that they're a legitimate business and that they have a good reputation. So not every item will apply to every vendor, but some of the most common things that we would look for is all of their basic information, including the full legal name, the address, all physical locations, their website. We want to know where they're licensed to do business and see their business license or do a check of the Secretary of State website. We may need to do sanctions checking such as OFAC or PEP, and we want to look at any specific certifications or licenses they may have. We will need to get that tax ID so that we can pay them, and we should run a basic credit report or DMB report. We need to know how the ownership is structured and start doing research about their reputation. So vendor complaints, negative news search, reputational risk, look at the Better Business Bureau. It's also really important to get a list of any material subcontractors they have, especially if they're critical, and always get a picture or a Google Maps view of the actual location. We just want to make sure it's not somebody operating out of the trunk of their car. Okay, so as it goes, low-risk vendors are just going to be usually that baseline document. But as we go to moderate risk, we're going to get all of that information, plus we're really going to start getting into their financials, audited financials, insurance certificates, all of their compliance policies, how they manage their own vendors. Sometimes we might need a SOC report, any audit reports, any relevant policies, whether that's AML or information security. We want to look at their record retention and data destruction policy, as well as background checks and hiring policies. Now, when we get into high-risk vendors, we're really diving deep, and we're going to leave no stone unturned. So we need all of the information that we've gotten for low, moderate, and we're going to add more emphasis on policies and actual procedures. We're going to really investigate their senior management and owners. We're going to look at things that are very detailed around cybersecurity and business continuity and get information about their outages. We probably want to go on site to make sure everything is as we need it. Now, we're going to get into specific documents to collect per risk type in just a moment, but right now we're going to take a break for a poll. Jesse?
Our second poll question of the day is, our organization requires the completion of due diligence before contract execution or renewal. Yes, sometimes, no, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here from the audience that we could go ahead and answer.
Okay, let's do it.
And that question is it okay for your vendor's inherent risk to change year over year?
Actually, it is okay. Keep in mind that your vendor's inherent risk can change anytime there is more risk or new or emerging risk. Let's say the volumes that you are purchasing change. Maybe you're using new technology. Maybe there has been another product or service added to what the vendor's offering. All of those are reasons why the inherent risk can change, and that's why it's really important to do that periodic risk reassessment to make sure that you're always, properly identifying those risks so that you can remediate them and monitor them moving forward. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our 7 steps of risk-based vendor due diligence infographic and matrix and the related content widget. Within this resource, you'll learn the steps of performing risk-based vendor due diligence and find helpful examples. Okay, back to you, Hillary.
Okay, so the next couple slides, we're going to look at different types of risk and the focus we might have on controls and what due diligence items to collect. So this first one is where we have a high business impact risk or a critical vendor. We're really looking to make sure that they have good communication practices and that we have very strong SLAs with monitoring regarding their performance and uptime. We want to pay attention to their business continuity and disaster recovery, including their plans, testing, and results. We want to really know about their human resources practices, like do they do background checks? What kind of training do they do? How do they manage the performance of their employees? We want to really dive into their compliance issues and, again, how they manage their vendors. So some of the things that we look for are those business continuity and disaster recovery plans and test results. We want to look at certifications, any associated policies and procedures. We want to get into that independent third-party audit, like a SOC 2 Type 2 report, to help us really understand what an independent auditor found. And we want to get a list of their critical vendors and proof that they're managing them appropriately. So what about vendors that host or store or even access or process or transmit sensitive information? Well, we're really going to have a big focus on their information security, their human resources, how they handle privacy, their general compliance, how they manage their vendors, and we'll want to know about their financial health. So things that we want to look at here are, again, those certifications, all their policies and procedures. That SOC 2 Type 2 report will probably want vulnerability and penetration testing, the list of their critical vendors, proof that they manage them well, their privacy policy, and a deep dive into their financials. Okay, in this instance, we're thinking about a vendor that directly interacts with our customers or clients. And you're probably starting to notice some trends here, but with this particular type of vendor, there's a lot of risk that's centered around the compliance risk and reputation risk. So our mitigating control areas are really about reputation, their people, how they hire them, how they train them, and how they perform. Privacy, all aspects of compliance and how they manage their own vendors. So of course, we're going to start getting all those certifications, including things like training logs for their employees, all their policies and procedures, and their privacy policy. Okay, so what about vendors that have unescorted physical access to your facilities? Of course, we're going to want to look at making sure that they have good internal communication and approval processes and that we have really clear SLAs with active monitoring. But we really want to know about those people who are coming into our facilities, right? So are they background checked? What kind of training do they have? How is their performance monitored? Do they understand privacy? So like if they see something in our office, they know not to repeat it. And what is their general compliance structure? We would ask for a list of all employees who will be granted access and evidence of a background check. We want evidence of privacy and compliance training and all associated policies and procedures. All right, in our last example, we're looking at vendors where there's a lot of expense with the vendor. Maybe we've invested a lot to get this product or service up and running, or it just takes a lot of money to maintain the service. You know, our mitigating controls are going to make sure that we have really good SLAs with active monitoring, that the vendor's in good financial health, and that we have good internal communication and approvals around this product or service internally. From a due diligence perspective, we're going to get those certifications and proof of regulatory compliance. We're going to get all those policies and procedures. We're going to dive into the SOC 2 Type 2 report, and we're going to do a really deep dive into their financials. Okay, so what happens when a vendor can't or won't give you documents and information that you're requesting? And this does happen all the time, believe me. So here's just a few suggestions. The first one is to push back on the vendor and ask them to tell you how you can validate those controls, right? So if you can't give me this, what can you give me? Sometimes that means that you're going to have to determine if what they're offering as an alternative is acceptable. And your SME can help you really determine that. Some cases, they may not want to physically give you anything or give you a copy, so you might want to be able to look at it on an online sharing platform like Zoom or even during a site visit. Alternatively, they might be able to offer you a redacted document so you can get most of the details without anything that might be super sensitive. In some cases, you might be able to have your subject matter expert interview a relevant person at their organization, such as your cybersecurity SME talks to their head of information security. Always assume that your existing vendors, that you have a right to audit with them, and they should be providing you documents and information when you request it. If not, go back and check your contract, and it may be something that needs to get escalated. No matter what, always document your attempts, right? If you ask for something and you don't get it, make sure you document that, because that information may become relevant during an audit or regulatory exam. In the case of maybe you decided that your organization was going to move forward, they were going to do a risk acceptance, or maybe you decided to terminate the contract because you couldn't get that information or not move forward and you end up in a litigation, that documentation is going to be important evidence. All right, so we're going to take a break for another poll question. Jesse?
Our next poll question is, our organization determines the frequency of periodic due diligence by the inherent risk rating and criticality, the residual risk rating, we don't do periodic due diligence, other, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
I'm ready.
Great. And this question is it possible to use previous due diligence and risk assessment results if you use the vendor for multiple services? Okay, so the answer to this is yes and no. So let me explain. When you do due diligence, the higher the risk, the more likely you're going to be collecting, like all of their policies or the SOC report. Now, some of those documents and information could apply to new products or services that you add. So in that case, you might just confirm with the vendor that what they've provided you is the most recent and updated version of that document. Now, what I don't want you to do, or what we cannot do, is to just assume because you've done due diligence on another product and service that all of that due diligence applies across the board, because each product and service has its own risk. So we want to make sure that we are validating the control environment and the risk management practices to address
the specific risks associated with that product or service. So just to recap, yes, you can reuse things that you already have if you confirm that they are the most recent versions. If not, you're going to have to gather all the information and documents like you would just like you were doing due diligence for the first time. So I hope that answers the question.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. As a reminder, in the related content widget, you can find what to do with vendor due diligence information ebook. Knowing how to conduct your vendor due diligence process is only part of the equation. This ebook dives into another challenge for some organizations, which is understanding how to interpret and act on due diligence results. Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
Okay, so like I mentioned, due diligence is never just one and done, right? It's something we need to repeat throughout the relationship. And that's because we always want to make sure that we have the most current documents and that the controls are still effective, right? They haven't failed or just become obsolete. So for all high risk and critical vendors, we need to do this at least once a year. Certainly can do it more frequently if you want to. For moderate, every about 12 to 18 months, depending on the product or service. You know, certainly some justify having more frequent reviews. Now for low risk, you can safely say every 3 years or before you renew any contracts or work agreements, mostly because we're just checking in to make sure there's still a legitimate and good business with a good reputation. Now, of course, there's plenty of things that can happen that can prompt off-cycle due diligence. You know, things like data breaches, changes to regulations, maybe the company's been acquired or has new management, or maybe we're seeing some declines in performance or financial health. All of those justify additional off-cycle due diligence. Just keep in mind that some of the documents that you're getting, such as stock documents or insurance certificates, they do expire, and they're not necessarily going to line up with your due diligence schedule. So keep track of those expiring documents individually and make sure that you're reaching out to request new ones even between due diligence cycles. So in general, there are some tips and tricks. One is to work with your subject matter experts to really create those vendor risk questionnaires and establish standardized lists of documentation by risk domain. This is going to help you be really organized in your vendor request and ask for everything you need up front, right, which saves everyone time and effort. You also need to work with your subject matter experts to determine if there are acceptable alternatives so that you can go ahead and ask the vendor for those. We always want to stick to our processes and document any efforts to collect information even if we don't get it. One thing to really understand here is that sometimes very large organizations like a Google or an Amazon, they're just going to ignore all your requests for due diligence. That happens, just document it anyway. Ensure that you have qualified SMEs, right? We want to make sure that the people reviewing these controls are actually qualified to do it, meaning they have professional certifications and qualifications in that risk domain. Always make sure you have a risk-based schedule for that periodic due diligence and think about any issues that are going to trigger off-cycle due diligence. Always make sure to track and manage those document expiration dates. Okay, to wrap this up, let's keep in mind that taking that risk-based approach is going to help us focus on the biggest risk, make better use of our resources. We can't treat every relationship the same. Set that expectation that critical and high-risk vendors are requiring the most thorough due diligence, which often means more documents to collect and sometimes a longer time to get through. Make sure you collaborate with your subject matter experts to make sure you have really good vendor risk questionnaires and a standardized list of due diligence documents. Don't forget to include that right to audit clause in your contracts, which will help make due diligence easier in the long run. And finally, remember that our residual risk rating is only a data point to help us understand if we're actually comfortable with that relationship and whether we should move on. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Thank you, Hillary, for another informative session. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, be sure to check out our standalone sessions in our webinar library. Specifically, we have an on-demand webinar covering risk-based vendor due diligence, identifying the proper scope, scale, and documents for a deeper dive. Before we move on to our next session, where Kelly Vick will discuss critical vendor contracts, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Once you return before the top of the hour, we do recommend refreshing your connection to ensure your connection is ready to go for the next sessions. Welcome back, everyone. Now we'll move into our next session, where we will be joined by Kelly Vick, VinMinder's president, to discuss how to treat critical vendor contracts differently. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jesse. And let's just jump right into this. You'll see in this first session and in this agenda, we're going to cover a quick review of vendor contract management and then spend some time focusing on critical vendors and some contract considerations with them. And of course, we'll end with some key takeaways. Well, let's start at a very basic place, and that is just talking about what is vendor contract management. So vendor contract management is the oversight of written agreements with your vendors or suppliers that you have chosen to do business with. There's several pieces that are involved in that. One is the negotiation, of course, of the terms of those contracts, and both parties, of course, are negotiating to ensure that the terms and provisions and controls that are important to each side, that they're discovered through the due diligence process and that they're appropriately addressed in the contract. The contract management also includes a process for ensuring that the contract is reviewed, approved, and executed properly, and hopefully your third-party risk management program outlines that as to how that should be done and that everybody knows how that should be done within your organization. Also, contract management includes ensuring that all of your vendor contracts, regardless of the value, are stored in some central repository with the proper controls. And I can tell you that this is very important because we've worked with many customers over the years when onboarding them just have no idea where to find all their contracts. So that is definitely a critical point. And then lastly, contract management includes the ongoing maintenance of that contract. So it's important to remember that contracts, once signed, should not be put on a shelf and collect dust. They should be reviewed. Depending on the criticality and the risk of the relationship with that party, it should be reviewed either on an annual basis or maybe something less than that. But the bottom line is it is not a one and done process, so it is something that should get your attention on a routine basis. So let's dive into a little bit of the details. What you're seeing on this screen are the major elements or provisions that you should find in all of your vendor contracts. Each of these provisions should be clearly outlined so that it is important, so that everybody, both parties understand what each party is signing up to. And depending on the regulatory requirements to you and your vendor will determine to some extent what provision should be included beyond these. But just for record, if you go and review the financial institution regulation around contract management, you will find very specific details on what should be included. So I call that out to everyone. But these are the major elements, regardless, that should be included. Again, your scope of service and expectations, pricing, of course, term and termination provisions are extremely critical, confidentiality, indemnification provisions, of course, limits on liability on both parties, what is considered a default, and then what happens if a default, ownership and license, a dispute resolution or remediation process, performance measures, and hopefully you are including those, compliance with laws and regs, data privacy, ownership and disposition of that data, ongoing business continuity and resiliency, subcontracting or your fourth parties need to be considered, and then ongoing monitoring to ensure that you're getting the appropriate information from your vendor to assess their risk every year. So these are some major elements that should be included in all contracts. With your critical vendors, these are some special considerations to keep in mind as you are writing your contracts with these vendors. One is to contemplate the requirements that you need to reduce or mitigate any material risk that's related to that particular business arrangement. Because remember, these critical vendors are those that, should they have a disruption in service, will have a significant impact on you and your customers. Also, make sure that there is clear and legally binding language. And in these contracts, it's, if you're not using legal professionals all the time, you probably want to use a legal professional with these most critical vendors, and be structured in a format that is appropriate to the relationships. They may include additional documents associated with a master agreement. There may be statements of work because you may have them specific to certain functions with that vendor. You could have schedules associated with specific pricing, et cetera. So they're probably a little more complicated than a simple arrangement with a non-critical vendor. And ensure that you have extra care and attention is placed on these contracts in that review and approval and authority process, again, with these critical vendors because of their nature to your business.
And here's the next poll question. With your third-party vendors, how often do you request to renegotiate the terms of your contract? Only at renewal? We will request renegotiation midterm under certain circumstances, such as a significant issue with a third party, when regulations or laws change that require it, other or not sure. Keller, while we wait for the results to tabulate, we can answer a question from the audience. What are best practices to track SLAs against deliverables laid out in contracts?
Sure. Best practices are to review and monitor the SLA performance on a regular basis. Of course, that regularity will depend on the service that's being provided and what your organization is expecting. I would say in a lot of instances, you would be looking for a monthly SLA review because you're getting a monthly SLA report, but in other instances, it may be a quarterly or an annual one. But first, you do need to receive that SLA reporting, and that's very important to note because it's just because you have SLAs doesn't mean you're automatically going to get reporting on it. So you need to be sure that in the contract negotiation, it's laid out in the contract and detailed how, one, that SLA is calculated and measured, and the reporting expectations of when you should get that. And then secondly, you certainly need to assign that responsibility to somebody because if somebody doesn't own it, then it's possible that it could not be done. And the last thing I would say is you should have some ongoing reviews with your business, with your partner, with your vendor. We call these quarterly business reviews or something like that, just to review the SLAs and other performance so that there is a two-way communication going on a regular basis.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, I would like to direct your attention to the related content widget. As a reminder, you can find our 9 techniques for vendor contract compliance infographic. Back to you, Kelly.
Okay, so in the next few slides, we are going to take a deeper dive into some different elements around your critical vendor contracts. And the first one that we're going to talk about is due diligence. So you should be performing those due diligence reviews prior to or in advance of any contract execution. And why is that important? Well, if you're following the guidelines of third-party risk management, during that due diligence phase, you're going to be uncovering issues that are at a positive to you in doing business with this particular vendor. So you will want to use those issues through that contract negotiation. That remediation and mitigation is covered in the contract language. Another reason is because you want to ensure that that contract is executed prior to going into business with this vendor so that, again, you've uncovered all of the legalese and the expectations of both parties to hopefully avoid and prevent future issues down the road. Now, there may be some times when you don't have the luxury to do that due diligence ahead of time, and you need to sign that contract. So there, you may consider adding some termination rights or some other language in the contract that allows for some post-contract issues to be remediated. Just some things to consider in those situations. If you recall, a few moments ago, I said that the contract processing is, or the contract management process is not a one and done process. So here on monitoring of that vendor, you're going to be monitoring the vendor performance, and those should be done on some kind of regular basis, most likely annually. And at the same time of monitoring their performance, you should be reviewing that contract as well to ensure that nothing has changed from a regulation standpoint, a risk standpoint that doesn't need to be renegotiated and amended in the contract. These critical contracts should also always be monitored for expiration dates, and definitely don't want to miss expiration dates around termination, but it's always a good review of that to make sure that it's captured correctly and being monitored correctly. And then, of course, again, back to the regulations that we're all living under, they're changing so quickly. So this is one of the things you are certainly wanting to review with your contracts on a probably annual basis, is just to ensure that some new regulation, such as a new state privacy regulation, for example, hasn't been enacted that you now need to take into consideration. When thinking and talking about critical vendor contracts, let's also keep these things in mind. One is that your vendor owners should be strongly encouraged to understand their critical vendor contracts. They may not be the legal experts, but they should be aware of the requirements, the performance expectations, the SLAs, the terms, etc. So ensure that that is a part of the vendor owner's responsibility. The vendor owner should also, again, be reviewing that contract on an ongoing basis. So whenever there is time to review the risks associated with that vendor, the contract is something to be reviewed at that same time. They should also be the ones reviewing the performance of the vendor. That may be done more frequently than annually. I wouldn't recommend reviewing the contract annual or more frequently than that, but definitely annually. And then also keep in mind that we need to be, or you should be, I should say, retaining the contract in some centralized system so that everybody can access, that needs to access it, can access it easily. Let's talk for just a moment about foreign-based third parties. Foreign courts and laws may differ substantially from the U.S. courts and laws, so especially as it relates to privacy, customer information, types of information that the third party or government entities may provide. So it's strongly advised that you seek legal advice when working with a non-U.S. based, in our case, third party, because there's so much particulars that need to be legally tracks. I'm not saying that they can't be done, because obviously we work, across borders all the time, but it is one of those contracts that could bring a great deal of risk with it if not reviewed by the appropriate person. And depending on the court, the jurisdiction of where you both land, then there's also, should it ever get to court, there's also risks with that. So bottom line is, if you're going to do business with a foreign-based third party, to engage legal counsel to ensure the contract is secure. And then you will find times when a vendor will just refuse to participate in due diligence, or require you to sign a standard contract without doing any negotiation and changes. These should be limited, of course, but there may be situations where you have no choice but to accept that. And when that does happen, it's just important to document that that is the case, that you were not able to review, that you made a business decision to accept the risk associated with the vendor without knowing what those actual risks are, that you accepted the contract as is without any negotiation, the business justification for that, and then just some documentation around all of that, because at some point in the future, probably an auditor or examiner is going to want to know the details behind that. So best to document that up front. And so to go along with the provisions that I provided a few slides ago, these are some additional provisions that should be included for your critical and high-risk vendor contracts. We'll just read through these really quickly. So information security expectations of that vendor. You may even have a separate addendum associated with information security. A customer maybe complaint management process, maybe some kind of rubrics grid that shows how that will be handled. Regulatory supervision possibly could be included. Data protection and processing agreement depending on the type of data that is being handled and maybe what state you happen to be located in or country. Data retention and disposition upon contract termination. That one is very important with a high-risk vendor because of the data that vendor will have access to. So if you want to make sure it's disposed at the end of your relationship, then that language should be in the contract. Definitely talking about disclosure of those critical fourth parties and those that have data access, that should be outlined in that contract. You probably want some insurance provisions, some minimum insurance requirements with these high risk and critical vendors, your right to go audit that they are performing as they say they are performing for you, and then some notification requirements that you may not have otherwise around maintenance specifically since this is a critical vendor, and around significant changes, especially as it relates to subcontractors, but other changes as well. On this slide, you will find 3 additional sample clauses to consider for your critical vendor contracts. Again, I would say these need to be on all of your vendor contracts, but this language is specifically, and this discussion is specifically around critical. But certainly indemnification, there's lots of ways to consider indemnification, whether it's a mutual indemnification, one-sided indemnification, whether it's against third parties or direct behavior or involvement of each company. So that's definitely one that requires some legal input. Warranty is another one. You typically find, at least with SaaS companies, this, as is language, and that is true, but there are some warranties that, most companies will want to see. Warranties like, using appropriate resources, talent, not injecting bad code and things like that. So again, another one that's worthy of your legal team's review. And then finally is assignments, and especially in the world of merger and acquisition activity, this one is a very important one to make sure you have right for your organization. On this slide, you will find 2 additional sample language, and that is one around limitation of liability. Of course, common language that needs to be on every contract, not just your critical vendor, but again, we're focusing on critical vendors in this discussion. And then around audits. Now, this is a pretty lengthy suggested language around audits. And I added this one because as we're seeing more and more requirements, regulatory requirements around your sub-processors, fourth parties, and how that is covered in your contract with your third party, and in particular in audit. So want to make sure that when you are incorporating that audit language in your critical and high-risk vendor contracts, is that you are making sure that that language is reaching beyond just that third party that you're directly doing business with. So this is something to take a look at and to consider deepening that language to make sure you cover for those fourth parties. And at this point, that brings us to our next poll question. So I will turn it back over to Jessie for a few moments.
The next poll question is, what is your company's response to contracting on the other party's paper? Our policy requires we use our paper and modifications to specific clauses are acceptable. Our policy requires we use our paper and no modifications are allowed. Our policy allows for the other party's paper but requires negotiation to ensure specific clauses meet our requirements. Our policy allows for the other party's paper with no negotiation, or you're not sure. Kelly, here's another question from the audience. Are MNDAs part of the contracting process?
Yes and no. There may be times when you put an NDA in place with a potential customer or a potential partner or a potential vendor in this case, and it never goes to contract. MNDAs or mutual non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, that just means it's one way instead of two ways, are usually signed to start conversations to go into business, to do some type of business together. You sign this agreement because you're going to be sharing information, and both parties need to be held responsible for keeping that information confidential and not sharing that information, and actually outlining the purpose of the information that is shared. So that's the key thing with an MNDA, is that it generally states the purpose of sharing that information. And a lot of NDAs also then say that that NDA will be in place until a further agreement is signed that either replaces the NDA, or you could, when you sign an actual contract with that vendor, you could reference that NDA to cover all of the confidentiality. So yes and no, it can be part of the contracting process, or it may never reach contracting if you decide not to do business with that other party related to the NDA.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. In the related content widget, you can find our resource, What to Include in Your Critical Vendor Contracts ebook. Be sure to grab this handy resource that talks you through what you should be including in your critical vendor contracts. Kelly, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so let's wrap this session up about your critical vendor contracts or your high-risk vendor contracts by taking a look at some key takeaways that we talked about today. One thing, of course, is to make sure that you have that contract management process in place, and make sure that you are using a reliable tool for that contract storage and tracking of those critical dates, such as expiration and other critical information. Maybe you have a homegrown solution, or maybe you're finding a solution, outsourcing to a solution to do that for you. The bottom line is, especially with these critical and high-risk vendors, is that you have some organized fashion in which you are maintaining all of that information. Of course, another one is to understand that the contract management with critical and high-risk vendors definitely does not end once the contract is signed. Do not let it sit and collect dust, not look at it again, because there have been so many changes and regulations over the years, and will continue to be, that these probably need to be adjusted in some way to account for those. Those critical vendor contracts should include additional provisions and very likely be reviewed by those legal professionals, especially if you are engaging with a non-U.S. vendor, or it's, you know, an extremely critical process that has such a significant impact on your business that you want to just make sure that it is buttoned up as tight as it could be in the event of kind of default or disruption with that business. And then when negotiating contracts, be sure that that is done, as well as the due diligence is done to actually executing the contract. And when that is limited, when you have the ability to do either one of those, document the process and how the decision was made to move forward. And with that, that brings us to the end of this session within the bootcamp. Jessie?
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for the informative session. If you're looking for more information on this topic, you can check out our webinar library for standalone on-demand and upcoming webinar sessions. A link to the webinar library is in the related content widget. Now we'll move into our next session, which is an overview of fourth and nth party vendors. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, so for this final session of today, we're going to talk about fourth party vendors, as Jessie just mentioned. So we'll talk about what that means, how to identify, assess, and manage your fourth party risks, and then how to determine if your third party is managing their vendor, your fourth party, appropriately. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's start by talking about what a fourth party vendor actually is. And it is a piece of this puzzle, as just noted here on this slide, just as your third parties are. So common names for fourth party vendor is subcontractor, subservice provider, nth party, or fourth party. And contrary to the name, there is more to third-party risk management than just third parties. It definitely includes managing the fourth-party risks as well. So a fourth-party vendor is one with which your third-party vendor has a direct contractual relationship, but you do not. And just as you are outsourcing work to your third parties are likely also outsourcing work to other vendors of their own that helps them in delivering the products and services you're receiving, which makes them your fourth party vendor. So that's how all of the puzzle pieces fit together. So for most all of you, fourth parties really do play an important part. Most of you are utilizing products and services from a vendor because otherwise, if you don't have relationships with vendors to provide you with products and services to offer to your customers, and that means you have to build everything you're going to offer them. And in this day and age, that's just not realistic. So just like you, your third party also has critical vendors that can disrupt their ability to provide the products and services to them, which then impacts the delivery to you. So negative impacts to your organization can be caused by failures of not only the fourth party, but the fifth party and the sixth party and so on, and that's the nth parties as we talked about earlier. So your organization must ensure that the products and services that you are purchasing from your vendors, especially those critical and high-risk ones, are provided by dependable vendors who have the right risks identified and mitigated and are providing you the correct service levels, and that you are contracted with all of that to ensure that they are on the hook for ensuring that their vendors are also committed to that level of service to you. So let's take a look at your vendor risk management universe. In your organization, you would likely see something like this with your third-party risks, your third-party vendors. You'd have a couple of critical vendors, a couple of more critical vendors that are pink and purple in this display, and then you have a couple of high-risk vendors, and you probably have other vendors in there as well. 74% of our third-party risk management survey respondents have greater than 100 vendor relationships. So just think about that as you're managing through your direct relationships contractually and through their performance and managing all of their risks. Because on the next slide, what you're going to see is how that blows up when you consider the fourth parties that get added to it. So let's take a look at that. So now remember, we talked about 100 vendor relationships or greater than 100. So each of them may have their own vendors, those fourth and nth parties, which increases your institution's risk exposure and decreases your visibility, because you could, as you can see, what was your direct vendors before, you now have many vendors that are critical to your vendors providing you service that also have your data, also have a risk impact to you. And, so you've got to keep your eye on them as well. And then there may be some you are not, you do not have any visibility to, as shown in the gray vendors that you see on this slide. So again, your universe has just drastically increased when you consider all parties. So why are you worrying about these fourth and nth party risks? Well, even though you don't have a direct relationship with them, there are hidden risks with these fourth and nth party vendors that can harm your organization. One is it provides now an expanded attack surface. And goodness gracious, we cannot open newspapers or go online these days without hearing about another cybersecurity attack. So now you need to remember that beyond those 100 vendors that you have in this example, it's now how many times greater than that because of all the fourth parties that could potentially be hacked as well. Again, regulatory compliance, violations of data protection regulations can occur through those fourth party breaches as well. Business continuity and resilience. I mean, you used to only have to think about the person you were directly being serviced by, but now they are outsourcing more and more of what they do, and so a business continuity situation with a fourth party will impact the third party, which in turn will impact you. So depending on the criticality of that vendor, more risk assessment and mitigation needs to be done in that area. The same with data privacy. You're not sure the controls that are in place with those fourth parties to maintain and keep the data that they have of yours private. A financial impact, a fourth party incident could cause financial losses, operational losses, maybe lost revenue, legal costs, etc. And then, of course, reputation and liability. I mean, and that's a common occurrence these days too, is having some kind of negative reputational impact that is not directly related to you, but happened down the line a bit, but still has an impact on you. So these are all the reasons why you do worry about the fourth and nth party risks. So let's just make sure that everyone is clear on when these fourth parties should be relevant to you. In the situation of your critical vendors and vendors who are high risk to you because they have access to very private data, then the fourth parties of those vendors deserve your attention. So is your third party critical? Again, would that fourth party have a material impact or host sensitive data of your customers? If that's yes, then does your third party rely on a vendor to support those services for you? So that's important to note too. So just because that third party vendor of yours has fourth party vendors, if they are not impacting the service that that vendor is providing to you or doesn't have any of your data, then they're not relevant to you. So only those organizations, your fourth parties that are relevant to your organization then are the ones that need to be disclosed and held accountable by your third parties. Okay, here's an example of some third-party vendors and some potential relevant fourth-party vendors that are associated with them. So a core banking provider, this is a company who manages the back-end services for the bank's standard operations, and again, you contract directly with this organization. That core banking provider could very well outsource their call center. So while they're providing all of the processing and data management and online services and everything, they may not be the one providing the call center services, and so that call center would then be a fourth party to you and critical to you because that's how your customers are getting serviced. Another example is a mobile banking app developer. Again, you have a contract with the developer to build and manage your mobile banking app, and they probably use a variety of outsourced specialists to ensure that that app is secure and functional. So maybe network management is a function that is outsourced, and your mobile banking app developer has a vendor that is providing that network management to them. And of course, that would be a critical function because that function is what ensures availability of that mobile banking app. And I know if you're anything like me, that's the only thing you're working on these days. So that mobile banking app is very critical to you. Therefore, that fourth party would be relevant to you.
We are to the last poll question of the day. And this question is, does your organization actively identify and monitor fourth parties? Yes, all fourth parties. Some, critical and high risk only. It's in development. No or not sure. Kelly, I have another question from the audience that we could answer. And that question is, Is it generally harder to get information from your fourth parties than it is your third parties?
As a general rule, yes, it's going to be harder because remember, your fourth parties do not have a contractual obligation with you and therefore can easily say no to your request of gathering information or due diligence from them. That's why you have to lean very heavily on your third parties to ensure that they have solid third-party risk management programs and practices in place where they are responsible for vetting and performing ongoing risk assessments of these fourth parties who are supporting you and who very likely have your data in their files. So with that said, there could be some extremely high risk and critical vendors where you would want some contractual obligations, but you would have those with your third party that is stating that the third party is agreeing to also provide you due diligence documents from the fourth party as well. That, of course, would be reserved for those, again, with the most critical impact to your business and customers. But we are seeing more and more of that these days with the customers that we're servicing.
Here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. Within the related content widget, you will find our fourth party due diligence questions, what to ask your third party infographic. This is a great resource to grab to learn questions and tips to use when discussing fourth party due diligence with your vendors. Kelly, back to you.
So on this slide, you'll see some risk management techniques for managing your fourth parties, and we're going to talk about each of these a little bit more in the upcoming slides, but it's identification, so knowing who they are, assessing them, and that means assessing their risk, and then managing the relationship that you have with your third-party vendors that create fourth parties. So let's keep going, and we'll talk about each of these in more detail. Well, the first place you have to start is actually knowing who those fourth parties are. So you need to, through your third parties, of course, ask them to provide you a complete list of all the vendors that may at any point have access to your data or who are essential for them to keep the lights on to support you. And this should be done, of course, with new vendors and then existing vendors as part of your annual due diligence and risk assessment. Just as you will change vendors throughout your lifetime as an organization, so will your third party. So you'll want to keep that updated. And then when it comes to your third parties, reviewing their SOC reports can be very useful in determining who their critical subservice organizations or fourth parties are, because they have to be actually detailed and part of that SOC audit. And then, of course, once your third-party vendors have disclosed their fourth parties to you, that will allow you to actually build an inventory of those relationships. So create that inventory of your fourth parties that includes the details about what product or service they are providing to your third party. And then look for concentration risk. By this we mean look for where your fourth parties are providing work for more than one third party vendor. That could pose a risk if you have multiple third parties attached to a single fourth party provider. Then should that fourth party have a business resiliency issue, now multiple vendors of yours are impacted. And then, again, do your best to maintain that data in a way that's useful and reportable and updated. So back to keeping it updated and refreshed on an annual basis. To actually manage fourth-party risk, you really need to be managing your vendor's third-party risk management practices. And you may not have a part of your third-party risk management process to do that today. And if you don't, it's certainly time to develop that. So what you'll need to determine is what questions do you need to be asking in your vendor risk questionnaires to determine your vendor's third-party risk management program and practices. You'll need a list of due diligence documents to request as evidence to support what they're telling you they're doing, what controls they're monitoring, what practices they have in place. And then you need to determine who will act as the official subject matter expert, if you will, in reviewing the third-party risk management risk domain. So looking at it as a risk domain, who is going to come in and evaluate, do they have strong practices in place and you can rely confidently on them, or do they not have strong practices and then maybe you need to do a little more diligence work to support that? So let's just continue that thought. Suppose you find out that the vendor doesn't risk assess their third parties. They don't verify controls, they don't monitor risk. So what are some steps you should take? One is discuss that with your vendor, because again, your expectation of them is that they are managing their vendors just as you are managing yours. You may need to review your contract with your legal department to see if you have any stronger legal rights in your contract to force the issue with the vendor. Consider requiring your vendor to carry more insurance. If you even know what their insurance coverage is, maybe start there and find out what that is, and then maybe require more if they don't have solid practices in place. Maybe you're going to monitor your fourth party in another way through some high-level risk intelligence that you can gather without documentation requirements. Maybe even reporting this up into your enterprise risk management team or risk committee so that there's broader oversight into this concern. You certainly might lean on amending the contract if it came down to that, possibly even considering alternate vendors if your third-party vendor does not satisfy this risk to you appropriately. And again, just don't renew the contract with them based on these requirements, and find a vendor who you can rely on, or force the vendor's hand to change their practices. So you've got some steps, some options you can take to help push the envelope with the vendor when you do find that they do not have those solid practices in place. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a few fourth and nth party challenges and some possible solutions. We've probably talked about a few of these already, but we'll go into them again. Again, fourth party monitoring. So you have concerns about specific fourth parties and the vendor has insufficient risk monitoring practices. We just talked about this on the last slide. So document the risk and the potential impacts if the fourth party fails, and monitor the fourth party using professional risk intelligence services. This would be an option for you to do. So risk intelligence services are designed to gather and analyze information from various external sources that do not have a dependency on gathering documents from a fourth party, or even a dependency on the fourth party authorizing you to do that. The main objectives of these services is to identify some potential threats and opportunities, and then you can decide, do you need to go in further? Think about these as looking through a window. So you're able to get some information, online, non-intrusive. There are services out there that provide this, and they can take a look through a window to get a view of how that fourth party is operating, maybe some information about controls, health, and reputation, things like that, before you know whether you need to then try to find another way to monitor them more thoroughly. So let's talk again about concentration risk. Remember, this is where you have several third parties using the same fourth party. So here are a few things you can do to help mitigate that risk. Again, document the risk and potential impacts if that fourth party fails. So if that fourth party fails, again, you have now multiple vendors who could also have an impact. So you need to understand across your organization how you're using those third parties, where those impacts could be with you. Again, work with your enterprise risk department or enterprise risk committee to include concentration risk in your overall organizational risk inventory. So there is a broad spotlight on that potential risk. And when appropriate, you may pursue a formalized risk acceptance by senior management. So if there really is a great number of fourth parties that could, or a fourth party that could impact a great number of third parties, it may be something that you need to escalate even further up the senior management chain. Again, consider alternatives. That's always an option. Monitor the negative news across those fourth parties, so hopefully you have a chance to get ahead of something, and again, possibly using that risk intelligence do the same. Another challenge might be that the fourth party just doesn't let the third party share information with you. So possibly in situations like this, if the fourth party could agree to sign a tri-party NDA between you, the third party, and the fourth party, maybe that would give them the comfort and, you know, the restrictions of you holding their data in confidence, that they would share some information with you. Maybe you could ask for it in some kind of redacted form so that they're limiting what they share with you. Or you could also require your third party to provide some kind of written attestation that they have actually gone in and done a risk management review of the fourth party's controls and practices. So you've got some options. And then what happens when you become aware of issues concerning a fourth party vendor? Some examples might be you've seen them in the news and it's not good news. You've seen a regulatory enforcement against them, or possibly they were part of a data breach. So the first thing you want to do is certainly immediately contact your third party and ask them about their understanding of the situation, ask them for some written response or mitigation plan on how they are working with their third party to resolve the issue, and then ask for a formal follow-up, you know, with some specific timing around getting the documentation back from them. Again, always consider, you know, informing senior management and your risk committee of situations like this, and then you may begin wanting to monitor news media for updates on that particular fourth party, just so you're taking a more proactive approach. And then, again, back to those monitoring services, those risk intelligence services that you might have, and possibly consider including that fourth party in them if you have them. So at the end of the day, you all have fourth parties that you're working with, because it's unlikely that a vendor that you're working with does not have a vendor that they're working with. So just here's some strategies to keep in mind for managing them. Again, educate your third-party vendors on your expectations regarding their third-party risk management practices. Review your standard contract terms and conditions to make sure that you have enough language in there to have those expectations of your third party, especially the provisions that you want to cover the fourth parties. Include third party risk management as a separate risk domain when performing due diligence, and then focus all of these efforts on those critical and high risk fourth parties. And that brings us to the key takeaways, which I probably mentioned on the last slide, but a reminder, a fourth party is a vendor that you do not have a direct relationship with, but you do have a dependency on them. If there are fourth parties that could significantly impact your third party's ability to continue to provide services to you, then those fourth parties deserve your attention. You certainly want to create an inventory of your fourth parties and look for that concentration risk. You want to include third-party risk management as a separate risk domain in your due diligence of your critical and high-risk third parties. When possible, you want to manage your fourth parties using some professional risk intelligence services or some type of monitoring like that. And then again, you want to monitor significant fourth parties using monitoring services, internet-based negative news alerts, things like that, so that you are hopefully being proactive in finding out what is going on with those critical fourth parties. And with that, that brings us to the end of this session, and I will turn it over to Jessie.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a very informative session on fourth and nth party vendors. For a deeper dive into this topic, we encourage you to check out our on-demand webinar session covering fourth and nth parties, what you need to know to effectively manage your extended third-party ecosystem. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our first day of the 3-day boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Hillary and Kelly, for their time in sharing some important information on vendor risk and vendor due diligence. Tomorrow, VinMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa May Hill, will join us to discuss knowing your vendor's cybersecurity posture to protect your organization, vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program, and assessing vendor SOC reports, reviewing findings and next steps. After Lisa, Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will join us to discuss managing AI risk with third-party risk management. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, this next question will come to you.
Okay.
Can you explain more of the difference between inherent risk ratings and how they should be applied at the product or service level, not just the vendor level?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand, again, that every product and service has its own unique risks. So let's say that you're using a vendor who is maybe selling you a data service, right, that has a lot of PII and things involved, but maybe they're also selling you a data storage solution where it's just basically cloud storage. Those two things may feel similar, but they have unique risks. And that's why when we go in and we do those inherent risk assessments, we're really looking at what's the risk associated with the product and service. Because if we try to look at it just at the vendor level, we're not going to figure out all the necessary risk management practices and controls that vendor will need to have and that we need to verify. So that's why you do that. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Hillary. Kelly, we'll jump over to you for this next question. And that question is, if I am contracting regularly with the same vendor or supplier for the same service over the course of several years, is it necessary for me to continue to perform routine reviews of this vendor? They are contracted to provide me services, so where is the risk?
Yeah, and I think Hillary mentioned this in one of her earlier sessions, and that is things can change. So again, regardless of the term of your contract with your vendor or supplier, whether it automatically renews, whether you've extended the term, in the case of high risk and possibly medium risk and definitely your critical vendors, you should always be conducting some type of due diligence on at least an annual basis for those high risk and critical vendors. There could be some vendor engagements, and I call them engagements, that's at that product level, referring back to that question that Hillary just answered, where you might even do it more frequently than that. But certainly during the annual review, as part of that due diligence, you want to go back and look at that contract language again, because as things might change with that vendor, things also might change in the regulatory environment, especially as it relates to privacy laws. Things might change with the vendor's performance against what your contract is saying they should be providing to you. So yes, absolutely, you need to be looking at it again and as part of your routine annual due diligence. So with the contract, it's not something that gets signed and put on a shelf and forgotten about. If you are in, especially the financial institution industry, it is a regulatory requirement for you to do both of these things, routine due diligence and reviewing your contract.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Hillary, we'll come back over to you for this next question.
Okay.
Risk management practices of vendors are sometimes confidential. How do we approach that issue?
So one of the first things that you can do and you should be doing when you want to do due diligence is making sure that there is a non-disclosure agreement in place between yourself and the vendor. Just like us, nobody wants to just throw out their confidential information. And so starting off with that agreement can be a really effective way of giving them a little bit more of assurance that we're only going to look at the things we need to look at, and we're going to keep it on a need-to-know basis. Sometimes, for example, there will be certain things a vendor cannot really disclose. So like a secondary backup location for a server farm or data center, those things can have real security implications. In those cases, we want to know that there is one and that it's been tested, for example. So start with that NDA, just walk through what you need with the vendor and see what you can negotiate in terms of getting the information you need without having them kind of spill all their secrets, as it will. I hope that's useful information.
Thanks, Hillary. Kelly, back over to you for this one. How do you recommend dealing with a vendor who is unwilling to amend their standard contract?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. Well, one thing that you have to determine is once you've gone through the risk assessment of that vendor and you understand the, risks that they present to you and the controls that they have in place and the controls that you have in place, does the risk then fall within your company's risk appetite, and is this product one you really need to have? So are you able, from a business standpoint, to just accept it and go as is and just move forward with the engagement? And that does happen regularly. I'm certain of it. So the important thing in situations like that is to have documented that entire process thoroughly and the decision that was made thoroughly, and if there were exceptions to your third-party risk management program, that those are documented as well, because when your examiners or auditors come in, of course, they're going to want to understand the reasons behind that. So that's the first thing I would say. If you can say no to either of those, if no, it doesn't, it falls outside of your risk appetite, your tolerance, you're not willing to take that leap of faith with them, but yet you still need that service competitively, you just can't live without it, then you may ask for, even though they're not willing to amend the contract, you may ask for some termination rights. They may or may not give that to you, but it's certainly something you should ask for. And then again, I think in the end, if they're just unwilling, just not negotiating anything at all, I think you just have to ask yourself, isn't there another vendor out there that I can go to that can provide me something instead of what this vendor is offering? I think you eventually have to get to that point. Jesse?
Thanks, Kelly. Hillary, I think we have time for one more quick question.
Okay.
What is a recommendation for due diligence if the vendor isn't willing to provide any of the baseline documents?
Well, here's the thing. The baseline documents are all of the information that you should be able to get through public sources. So name information around the ownership, location, physical address, etc. You should be able to get these from their website. I would be really cautious and treat it as a red flag if I'm dealing with a vendor who doesn't want to provide any information. Yeah, and the pushback to the vendor is we have an obligation both to our organization, to our customers, and our regulators if we're in a regulated industry to do our homework. And we cannot proceed with a relationship without it. So that's a conversation I would have right from the beginning. Again, if you need an NDA to kind of give them confidence around how you'll treat that data, that's an important step to take. But if somebody's not giving you baseline information, I would treat that very seriously and have questions about it. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary and Kelly, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and also free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you can find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as the ones discussed today: vendor criticality, due diligence, contract management, and more. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. Be sure to check out our webinars page to find several standalone sessions on each of today's topics that dive a little bit deeper. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow or Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day one of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to give another big thank you to Hillary and Kelly for their time and content. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow for our second day of the bootcamp.